deep dive into topics covering wellness and prevention, performance, recovery, and injury management. Our mission is to provide the latest science-based information to help you get the most out of your grappling journey, both on and off the mats, and help you overcome any challenges you may be grappling with. Dr. Hardy is a licensed physician and BJJ practitioner, but the contents of the podcast are meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. Please seek out personalized care from your own medical provider prior to implementing any medical treatment or intervention.
All right, we're live.
How
do you feel, Olivia?
I'm sweating.
No, it's gonna be great.
She's sweating.
So I'm really happy to have you here. I don't have to look at Bill for a couple hours. We can just make fun of him the whole time. I think it'd be awesome. So, yeah, I know you're passionate about this subject we're going to talk about today. Probably have lots of questions too. So that's why we brought you up here. So today we're going to talk about cholesterol like we teased last week, right? With the whole dietary fat thing and the American Heart Association stuff. So to start with, we probably should say, what is cholesterol? What is it anyway? Because it's used in so many different ways in, conventional, you hear about it all the time on the news, or, people talking about, oh, you got to lower your cholesterol. What does that actually mean? Before we start and get into it, I just want to tease something real quick. So there was a doctor named George Mann. He was one of the principal investigators in one of the largest studies on health from what we call a cohort. They followed a bunch of people over their lifetime. It's called the Framingham study. You may have heard of it. But, so he's known for being one of the principal organizers and investigators in that. And a quote I'd like to read that he said, that I can't remember, I think this was in the 2000s sometimes, he said, "Saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet are not the cause of coronary heart disease. That myth is the greatest scientific deception of the century and perhaps any century." So that's pretty strong words there. And we're going to kind of delve in to see, why he may have said that. So what is cholesterol? It's a precursor to a bunch of stuff. We've talked about how, when we did the vitamin D lecture, how cholesterol was the precursor molecule for vitamin D. We also talked about how it is also a precursor for many of our hormones. So it's pretty important. There's steroid hormones too. Bill, not anabolic steroids, but, our hormones. Sorry, we caught Bill halfway in.
I got some steroids right here.
You got to a Reese's piece. What is that? A Reese's peanut butter cup over there?
This is a Reese's Nutrageous.
Oh, that's amazing.
King size.
Of course it is. So the steroid hormones I'm talking about are like, pregnenolone, cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, all pretty important stuff. And they are all made from cholesterol. So we should also talk about some of the other important aspects of cholesterol. It is really important in cell membranes. So each cell is surrounded by a membrane made of fats called phospholipids, but cholesterol is stuck in there, and it helps stabilize the cell membrane, and it helps, it acts as an antioxidant. Because if you remember last lecture, I talked about when we eat a bunch of polyunsaturated omega-6s, they get kind of stuck in cell membranes too, and they're precursors to inflammation, but they are also susceptible to oxidation, if you remember that, forming free radicals. Cholesterol in the cell membranes helps prevent the spread of those free radical chain reactions. So it acts as an antioxidant too. So it is pretty interesting. It also is really important in nerve cells. So neurons have a cell body, but they have these long projections, so-called the wiring of the nerve cell, called an axon. It's the long projection that actually makes the connections and forms the nerves. The insulation around the axon, you can think of it like insulation around a wire. That's called myelin. And cholesterol is really important in that insulation process in myelin.
I actually had a question about that when I was reading your book.
Uh-oh. Dang, I'm slow.
Okay. So, and I may be wrong about this, but
Yeah.
does myelin have anything to do with Alzheimer's? Does that play a role in that?
Myelin has more to do with multiple sclerosis, actually. And that's
Okay.
what happens, actually. You actually get attack of your immune system on the myelin sheath of the nerve cell. So there's more to do with that.
Okay. So does cholesterol then, is there like some sort of like deficiency that they're having that would cause the attack?
So I don't think I'd have to look at that. It's a really good question. I don't, as far as I'm concerned, it's primarily an autoimmune attacking parts of the myelin.
Okay, but not the cholesterol. That's part of
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of, but it is really important in the proper functioning of nerves. And it's kind of interesting. And it's really interesting, you know, since we're talking about things like Alzheimer's, aging, what they've shown is really interesting correlations where in older people, the higher their cholesterol, the less their all-cause mortality was. It's very interesting, isn't it?
That is interesting.
It's kind of counter to what you've heard. Or, you're going to die if you have high cholesterol.
Oh yeah.
As you age, that having higher cholesterol seems to be protective, and it kind of makes sense when you know all the things that it does. So, knowing that it's important, the body is very, very good at maintaining levels of cholesterol. So if you take some in your diet, it will reduce what it's making internally. If you reduce what you're taking in your diet, let's say I'm going to eat no cholesterol. Let's just say you decided that. Your body will upregulate and make more because it's important. So it's really hard. The point of that is it's really hard to change your blood cholesterol levels to any appreciable degree for any length of time by diet. About 5% plus or minus, basically. So that I'm just talking because you hear that all the time. You got to stop eating.
Dietary cholesterol, eggs and stuff like that.
Well, and they used to, that used to be part of the recommendations where, you should keep it under a certain amount. About 2015, they finally said it's really not a nutrient of concern. The science was so overwhelming that it really hadn't, that they kind of took it out of, they even said it's not a nutrient of concern, yet some of the latest guidelines still have carryovers. They can't let go of it. And like, oh, you should probably not eat excess cholesterol. And I don't know why they keep doing that, but.
I don't know if this would fit in at this time, but okay. So cholesterol, I know you're saying is like the precursor to a lot of these hormones. Where does cholesterol come from? Right.
Cholesterol is made in most cells in the body.
Okay.
It has a very long, let's see, the biosynthesis of cholesterol, you're asking, I think it's over 40 steps chemically. It starts as a precursor to something called acetyl-CoA, which is a metabolic intermediate from glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Before the Krebs cycle, you probably heard of that.
Yeah.
So there's a whole sequence, a very complicated biochemistry in synthesizing cholesterol in the body. And there's one of the enzymes responsible for one of the steps in cholesterol is called HMG-CoA reductase. You don't need to know that, but that's actually the enzyme that's inhibited by statin drugs.
Oh, okay.
The statin drugs inhibits that enzyme in one of the synthesis steps in cholesterol.
To prevent the production of it.
What it actually does is it reduces production, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, of cholesterol, which then tells the body to make more cholesterol receptors because it's like, hey, we need cholesterol. So we need more cholesterol LDL receptors, I should say, not cholesterol receptors. Yeah. We're going to talk about that extensively here in a minute. I just want to bring that up that, yeah, it's made, liver makes a ton, but it's made in most cells of the body.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have that ability to synthesize it. So and it's so tightly regulated that's why the dietary thing, it never made much sense to me. I went into medical school already with my undergrad in biochemistry. And then I started hearing some of the stuff. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, because they were talking about dietary cholesterol. I was like, I was one of those guys answering, raising my hand and asking the question that they were like, probably didn't want to hear or dodged it or so it's always been kind of problematic for me from a first principles perspective. Anyway, so I think it's really important because when someone says, hey, you go into your doctor's office and like your cholesterol's high.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what does that mean? What are they looking at, right? So they're looking at these blood tests. You've heard of LDL, so-called good cholesterol, and then HDL, so-called quote unquote. For those of you listening, I'm doing air quotes with my fingers. Bad cholesterol versus good cholesterol, both in air quotes. Cholesterol is cholesterol, period. It'd be like if I said you're bad, Olivia, for driving in a sports car, and you're good, Olivia, when you're on a bus.
Okay.
You're still you.
Yeah.
Okay. The transport molecule is what's important in this, what carries this. And that's what is going to be the biggest part of this podcast today is we're going to kind of break this down visually too. I think it'll help people. And those of you that are listening to this audio, this is going to be a really important clip I'm going to see if Bill will probably splice one out. So you could just look at the visual aspect of it instead of watching the whole podcast on video, we'll have a little YouTube portion so you can go back and watch the visual demonstration here because it's going to be very important. Anyway, the carriers. And so that's where the rubber meets the road here. So when your doctor says your cholesterol is high, the standard tests we call lipid panels, they measure cholesterol associated with the carriers. They don't measure the carriers themselves. And that's very, very important. So when they say your cholesterol is high, it's like, well, okay, but that doesn't tell me anything about what my carriers are doing, the so-called lipoproteins. And that's what we're going to talk about now.
Like how many carriers you
How
have?
many, how big, what size. And so,
okay.
And that matters. Okay. It really does. Because what we found, they used to say, oh, your LDL cholesterol is high, so-called bad cholesterol. First of all, cholesterol is not good or bad. It's necessary. So what we really should be saying is your LDL particles, are this or that, but we're not. The standard in your doctor says, oh, your LDL cholesterol is high, so we got to put you on a drug.
Yeah.
We need to ask a lot more questions because for years they use LDL cholesterol as the risk factor marker for progression to heart disease. What we found, accumulating evidence, especially over the 20 years now, is that it is actually a very poor predictor because over 50% of people that are having heart attacks have so-called quote unquote optimal cholesterol. So there's a lot more. Cardiovascular disease is multifactorial. There are many causes for it, but they've hung their hat on this cholesterol thing, and it really hasn't shown to be predictive. And it's going to be through the demonstration today. Hopefully we're going to understand why it's not predictive. So the best place to start is to talk about these carriers, I think, and what they do. So what I'm going to focus on right now is how the body handles fats produced by the body and cholesterol produced internally. Dietary fats and cholesterol are actually carried by another type of carrier called a chylomicron. You don't need to know this, but we're not going to go huge into that right now, okay? Because that's not where the primary risk for heart disease seems to be from that carrier. Okay, it might contribute a little bit, but that's not where we're going to go. I don't want to muddy the waters too much. Go ahead.
Oh, that's the dietary fats that you consume?
Dietary fats and dietary cholesterol. Basically, the chylomicron is a lipoprotein, lipo meaning fat, protein meaning protein. It's a protein carrier of fat or cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid too. So when you, just briefly since you asked, when you eat dietary fat, it's absorbed through the intestine. Inside the intestine, it will be broken apart and repackaged as a triglyceride and some proteins and be assembled to this carrier called a chylomicron, which then will be exported through the lymph out into the bloodstream and then carried to, probably to fat stores, depending where that dietary fat needs to go. It depends on your energy status of your body. If your body is on an energy deficit, a lot of that dietary fat will be shuttled for utilization pretty quickly. If we're not, and we're kind of sitting around eating ice cream and potato chips, the dietary fat's going to go more to storage. So where that goes depends on kind of the energy status. Yeah. But I don't want to focus a whole lot on that one, but it sounds like you have a question.
Well, so So are triglycerides then fats that you've eaten? Like, is that kind of what
Both.
makes those? Okay.
And that's what we're going to talk about here, how the dietary thing goes. So let's switch over, because I think this is going to be helpful to kind of frame what we just talked about from dietary. Let's talk about the things that are produced internally, cholesterol, and oh, by the way, triglycerides too.
Okay.
So the liver will produce triglycerides, okay, when you eat, especially when you eat excess carbohydrate in the form of glucose or fructose, or, sugars, starches, things like that. When they're in excess, we've talked about this in the, I believe the strength training, the nutrition lecture with Brittany, we were talking about if you eat and clear out the muscle glycogen, you'll have room for that sugar somewhere to go. Yeah. Well, when it doesn't have anywhere to go, the liver says, okay, we got to get this stuff out of the bloodstream.
Yeah.
We don't want to, so we're going to make it into triglycerides. It's called de novo lipogenesis. All that means is from new making fat.
Sounds like a cologne.
It does. We should do that. But just,
what are you wearing?
Yeah.
De novo
lipogenesis. So when when we and alcohol does the same thing. You've heard of fatty liver?
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to ask
right.
you. Does this play
yes.
a role there?
So this is a good little diversion here to kind of set the stage. Fatty liver with alcohol's toxic. It's a solvent. Ethanol is. So the body has to get a way to dispose of it. It will contribute to making triglycerides as well too. The liver is part of its byproduct. Drinking chronically all the time, the liver is trying to export that into fat, but a lot of it kind of gets stuck in the liver, and then the fat starts infiltrating the liver itself, forming fatty liver disease. Okay. Unfortunately, what we found in the last 25 years or so is we're seeing an increase of this in non-alcoholics, children, called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is almost all caused by sugar.
Yeah.
Sodas, high fructose corn syrup, all this excess.
You told me before, orange juice.
Yeah, of course. Any high concentration of sugar where the body doesn't have anywhere to put it.
Red Bull?
I don't know, man.
Well, it's funny because, when you grew up, like orange juice, oh, that's great for, heart healthy, like all this other stuff for your breakfast.
Since we started processing more and more, people have gotten fatter and fatter, right? Because how many oranges does it take to make a cup of orange juice?
A lot.
You're right. Would you eat that many oranges?
Never.
Right. That's the point.
And
oranges,
you're losing like the fiber.
That's right. And you're getting all the, having fiber with the sugar makes a big difference in how it's disposed and how much, when you just dump a whole bunch of sugar, the liver's like, oh no, So we have this thing called de novo lipogenesis, which means making triglycerides, making fat. So when that happens, the liver then packages that fat it's making, tries to export it out of the liver through the bloodstream, and it gets dropped off whenever it can be utilized or stored, mostly adipose tissue or fat tissue. There's a enzyme that cleaves those triglycerides off the carrier and shuttles it into the fat for storage. Okay. So what that is, this is a perfect time to talk about. And Bill, in a second here, we'll definitely need that other camera. So, that would be your cue, sir. While Bill gets that set up, because this is a really important visual, that I'll talk to you about it, how it starts to be formed is the carrier that those triglycerides and cholesterol that is produced is carried into put into something called VLDL, which is a lipoprotein called very low density lipoprotein. Density refers to, because fat is less dense, protein is denser. Okay. The more fat something has, including cholesterol, the less dense it is. Okay, so if you have this big bloated fat-filled thing, it's low density, but it may be bigger. Okay, it's just like anything, like a brick of gold weighs more than a brick of styrofoam. Because gold is much more dense. Yeah. Right. So styrofoam has more space in it. So you can think of the same kind of concept with VLDL, which is made and secreted by the liver. How are we looking, Bill?
Better than ever.
Yeah,
I'm
I know
on the screen right now.
Are
so.
you? Oh,
Hey,
yeah. Oh,
boom.
right.
It's ready.
It's a challenge.
The camera's ready.
You are a patient person, Moby.
I thought. Whoop! There it is. I thought you were just gonna call me a patient of some sort.
No, I'll save the insults till later.
Mm.
But since you were talking, so one of the reasons why, not only because Olivia is very passionate about the subject and has a lot of good questions, but I also wanted Bill away from this because I was afraid he would eat the props here.
There's not a question in my mind.
You would definitely be here and just eating while you're showing.
What you can see here is the role of cholesterol today will be played by the yellow M&M. And if Bill was here, those would be gone, and this podcast, the whole visual would be destroyed. The role of triglycerides are going to be played by the blue gumball. Okay. So what happens here is the triglycerides, especially, let's do a couple different scenarios. When you make a VLDL, it either is packed with a ton of triglycerides, depending on your diet. So if you're eating lots and lots of sugar, starchy, processed carbohydrate, lots of flour, where it has nowhere else to go in the body, it can't go into the muscle cells because that's full because you've been lazy and you haven't done any exercise. It will have more triglycerides to get rid of. It will have a little bit of cholesterol, but it will have a lot of these in there.
I feel like you're describing Bill right now.
Well,
okay, he's not lazy, but he does eat a lot.
No, well, but the amount of exercise he does really makes a big difference.
That's true. That's true.
So I can't really I got to defend him a little bit there.
I'm taking over this stream.
So yeah, we're at his mercy there as far as control. So this is the first scenario. So this is a VLDL. You can see this big blue thing here. The red stripe around it, I'll talk about later because you can see there's
more in focus. Like you got your little airstrip there.
Here.
Yep. Like that's if you hold something like down there, then it's
perfect.
Nice, more in focus.
We'll do that then. I'll move down a little bit. What this is down here, we're going to use later. This is kind of a cross section of an artery with the red being the blood and the white being the walls. But for right now, let's just don't worry too much about that. So we have a VLDL here produced to shuttle out those triglycerides because it's got to get it out. And we're going to try to go to fat cells usually. So as this travels through the bloodstream, it goes to a fat cell. There's something called lipoprotein lipase. A lipase just means fat cleaving. And it will take the triglycerides out of this VLDL. And remember, they're packed full of triglycerides because we ate a whole bunch of starch and sugar that didn't have anywhere to go. We're going to have two different scenarios. This is the first one. Because there's so many triglycerides, there's less room for cholesterol. So after these are dropped off, so to speak, at the fat cell, then this VLDL is converted to an LDL. But the type of LDL then is this little guy. The yellow is cholesterol. So now we have what's called a small, dense LDL. Because there wasn't enough room in this VLDL because, the triglycerides took up all the room. And when they're gone, there's just a little bit of cholesterol in there. Okay. And the lipoprotein is transformed. And by the way, this is grossly simplified. There's a lot of steps involving, even involves HDL and how all this stuff happens. But for simplicity's sake and for understanding, now we have a small, dense LDL. Okay, that's the first scenario. So we're going to that's one possibility here. And we'll put this here with an air, here's one possibility if you have, ton of, you're eating ton of sugar and that kind of thing.
Is it because the excess sugar is getting converted to fat?
Triglycerides.
To triglycerides,
fat.
And then the
VLDL
is
packed. It's transporting them
and
out.
And that's why it's
packed.
LDL, because it's low density.
Now it's lower density because we've taken the fat off and deposited them at fat cells.
Yeah.
Okay. So now you're left with a low density LDL, but a very small dense one. Okay. As opposed to, let's say, I'm going to take some of these out of this one and put them in. Here's another scenario. So I've put some triglycerides in this too, because it's not all or none. Okay. Let's say we eat a relative, two possibilities. We haven't imported a lot of sugar or starch into our system from our diet that the body has to deal with, the liver has to deal with. There's two scenarios. Either you're eating a very low carbohydrate diet, or you're disposing of that sugar because of your workout.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And you have a place in the muscle for it to go. So the liver doesn't have to make as much triglyceride now because it doesn't have as much glucose to dispose of and make into triglycerides. Right. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it can carry more cholesterol now. There's more room on the bus, so to speak. So because cholesterol has to go out to the cells, right? And it's really important for the cells will take it up. And so this is the initial transport molecule. In this case, because there's less triglycerides, once we drop the triglycerides off, instead of this little guy, we're left with this type of LDL. You can see there's more cholesterol in this guy. Obviously, this isn't the scale. I just wanted to make a big stark contrast for the viewers to be able to actually see there's a difference, okay? So, don't say, hey, that's not really to scale. Of course it's not. These are microscopic.
I don't have M&Ms in my blood.
You may.
I was going to say.
You very well may have M&Ms in your blood. I would not be surprised.
Look at you with the jokes.
Hey, man, you're over there. I just feel brave all of a sudden.
I'm angry.
So that's that pathway where we're forming so-called large buoyant. And you'll hear me talk about small, dense LDL, large buoyant LDL.
Which one was the dense?
The small one.
Okay.
The one that says small is the small one. And the one that says large is the large one. So small, dense, large, buoyant. They're both low-density lipoproteins. They're both LDL. So that begs the question when your doctor is like, oh, your cholesterol's high. They're just measuring the passengers in here. They're not measuring whether it's a small one or a large one. I'll tell you why this is important here in a second. Okay. We tracking so far?
Yes.
Okay. These LDLs will go through the bloodstream. Like how? Yeah. Pretty happy with this. So you can see for those.
We'll send this to your parents.
Yeah, exactly. So the grappling folks here, I got war tape here. So representing the endothelial cells. So here's the bloodstream with the red, denoting blood. This white stripe with all the little hash marks are a series of endothelial cells. They line the artery. And behind that are the muscular part of the artery, the intima, and the muscle parts below the surface of the lining, which is the endothelial cells. Okay. When these LDL, remember, these are both LDL. They travel through the bloodstream. They get to a cell to drop off their cargo at something called an LDL receptor. Imagine if we're going to use a vehicle analogy, this is a bus, this is a car. It's going to go to the bus stop and drop off its passengers. The bus stop is the LDL receptor. Okay. The LDL receptor binds very well with this type of LDL.
Okay.
Remember, this is low density lipoprotein. So is this. This is a small dense one. This is a large buoyant one. So they're flavors. And it's also not binary. There's, it's a gradation, right? I'm just, here are the extremes. So this one, it turns out, doesn't bind well with LDL receptor.
Which one's that one?
This small dense one. Thank you for telling me that, because there's plenty of people that aren't watching this. This small dense one here doesn't bind well to the LDL receptor. So it's left floating in the bloodstream longer. The longer LDL is in the bloodstream, the more it is susceptible to being oxidized and having bad things happen to it. Okay. So the faster it's gotten out of circulation by docking to the receptor, the better. Now, it turns out this one, not only this one, meaning the small dense one, the small LDL, not only does it not bind well with the receptor, but is also more susceptible to oxidation. Remember, we talked about that last week, where we talking about those polyunsaturated fats have those double bonds in there, and make them targets to be oxidized.
And that was that because they have an electron that needs?
Yeah, they have the double bond has an electron that is just hanging out there like on a fish hook for a shark.
Starts breaking off other things, right?
Well, what happens is something comes in and grabs it.
Okay.
And then it forms an unpaired electron, which is called a free radical. And then that's called oxidation. Okay. Oxidation and inflammation go hand in hand, especially chronically, long-term, for driving diseases like diabetes, heart disease, the whole 9 yards. Okay. So this one also is prone to be oxidized more, like I said, which is not good. The immune system gets really reactive to these. These are called oxidized small dense LDLs now when that happens. So the longer it stays in the bloodstream, the more chance it is. The large buoyant LDLs, these big, remember these are still LDL, are less prone to being oxidized. If you left them in the bloodstream long enough, of course, they still can become problematic.
So, and maybe you already said this, but so why is it that the small LDL is more prone to being oxidized?
It's exposed more.
Just because of the fact that it's
small, dense,
receptor
and it's in the bloodstream longer.
So
and it's a good question.
Okay.
Well, it also, not only does it not bind to the receptor well, but it also likes to get stuck into the arterial wall here, this endothelial cell lining here. And once it does that, bad things happen. The immune system gets involved at that point. And what happens to these small dense ones, and I want to circle back because I wanted to finish a thought on that polyunsaturated omega-6. When those are incorporated into, because this LDL carrier is composed of a bunch of what's called phospholipids, which are just basically a little membrane on its own, cell membrane. Those are fats. The more polyunsaturated omega-6 in your diet, not only does it deposit in throughout your body, but it also gets more into the LDL particle as well too. So you have a higher concentration of omega-6 polyunsaturates in here, which makes it even more prone to oxidation because of all those stuff, right? You get it so far?
Yeah.
So this will then latch on to places it's not supposed to go. So it's not binding to a receptor here. It's getting stuck in the artery wall. What predisposes damage anyway to the artery wall here? High blood pressure, inflammation from diabetes. All these things are very, very bad for the endothelium. That's what these are, endothelial cells. That's what they're called. And so the more, let's say you can imagine like running a pipe at a pressure higher than it's rated for. You're going to get structural failure and cracks in it, right?
Yeah.
Think of the same thing with high blood pressure. You're starting to get damage to the wall. And then these things now are even more prone to kind of getting stuck in there because of that. These are less prone. The big one. Yeah. Thank you, Bill. Keep saying that because I get stuck in the visual, forget that most people are listening on audio. So yeah, the big one is less prone
to get caught on.
Yeah. Because it binds the receptor and is taken out of the bloodstream a lot better. Okay. Once this little guy gets caught here, the little LDL, the small dense one that's been oxidized, is caught in the artery wall. It gets pulled through and gets below the lining, the endothelial lining. And in this space, we have something called macrophages, which are part of the immune system. They're like, hey, you are not supposed to be in here. And it comes by and engulfs it. Okay. When a macrophage engulfs a bunch of these small, dense LDL particles with cholesterol, it starts forming what's called an atheroma. And what that does is it starts bulging from the inside. And what I'm going to do now is put down over time what happens. So those of you that are listening to audio, this will be a really important one to watch on the YouTube clip, because now we have these small dense LDLs now below in this lining being eaten by these macrophages, and the macrophage turns into something called a foam cell. And it just means, they've basically engulfed a bunch of these small, dense LDLs because they're like, hey, you're not supposed to be here, right? It's an inflammatory response.
Your immune system's trying to protect you.
And over time, that space builds up and it forms this little wedge from the inside and pushes out into the arterial space. And the visual that people are watching can see is I've significantly narrowed my artery because of this, what's called an atheroma. Oma means mass. Atherogenesis is what happens to blood vessels during heart disease. That's the technical term for it. So if you hear someone say this has more atherogenic potential, that just means it's more prone to be causing this type of right. Where the small dense LDLs now are more prone to get stuck in there, being eaten by these macrophages, becoming foam cells, becoming an atheroma, narrowing this artery over time. So where the large buoyant LDLs, not as much. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Why see, I never knew that it kind of created like that blockage from underneath the wall. They always make it seem like there's a plaque buildup in your
So what happens is, well, it's not all or the other. Once you get this atheroma formation, this is the immune system has a high interest in this whole area now. This is all a big inflammatory area. Yeah. You start getting things like platelet aggregation, things in here stuck to the sides of it, forming even more. Calcification takes place over this. You've heard of calcified artery. So part of this is damaged area. So you'll have more calcium deposition down here, right? And so that's just part of the process that happens. And so you'll get this whole thing becomes a plaque, basically. The danger is now that it's narrowed, if you have some of these things breaking off upstream from it and then blocking off this very narrowed area, that's when you have heart attacks, because now you are not getting blood flow to that area of the heart and starts to die. So anyway, that's kind of how the LDLs, and you can see it makes a difference between what type of LDL you have. Okay. Yeah. Not only is it the type of LDL particle that's important, but also more importantly, the number of LDL particles. Because even a high number of these large buoyant LDLs that stay in the bloodstream a long time still can become problematic too. They're not as prone to oxidation because, they bond to the receptor a little better, but we have to take them into account. So let's do a couple scenarios here for everyone. So let's look at a couple cholesterol numbers. Let's say you go into your doctor and they I'm making this up because I know your level, I know you're looking good as far as you showed me your lab results, but let's just make up some numbers for you. Let's say your doctor says, hey, your LDL is 150. That's over the limit. It's high. That's a problem. And so that's just, what does that mean? That means your LDL cholesterol is high. That means the cholesterol associated with the LDL, they're saying is high. Does that tell you anything about what type of LDL you have? No. Because here's the two scenarios. Let's say you have, what I'm doing for people that aren't watching is I'm putting more of these big, large, buoyant LDLs down. See all that cholesterol they're carrying? Okay. Let's say that we looked further into it, and by the way, there are other tests you can do to actually measure your particle size. Okay, that's an NMR particle size, and you can actually order it. Your doctor can order it if they know about it. If they
what's it called?
It's an NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance lipoprotein profile. So it will tell you the number and the size, the relative size.
So if your number is large, 150 or something like that,
your LDL, your cholesterol number,
right?
Then that will help you determine, well, is that LDL cholesterol predominantly carried by these large buoyant types of LDL that are less prone to oxidation,
right?
More easily brought into the receptor.
This.
Well, we're going to talk about that a lot. That's yes.
Okay.
Now, let's say the same thing. Let's do a different. Let's say Bill. We're going to use Bill now.
Use me.
So, just from what we know right now, if we know that your large, buoyant LDLs are more responsible for your 150 cholesterol, that is not because these have been associated with a much lower risk of heart disease. So your LDL cholesterol of 150 is probably not a very good predictor of you developing heart disease if you have a lot of these large buoyant types. Okay. Let's say Bill, and he's bragging on you because he goes, I just got back from my doctor. My LDL's 130. Take that.
130.
Yeah, lower than your 150. What's up? Okay. But that's all we're going to talk about. We're going to go into the other parts of the lipid profile and how we can tell a little more. But let's say Bill, when we did his measurements, oh no,
cholesterol spilled.
I spilled the cholesterol.
You just spilled my cholesterol?
I did.
My hard ones?
Dude.
What?
I don't.
Your small ones.
My small and hard ones.
Yeah.
Small,
not
low density.
Not cholesterol, Bill. Cholesterol is cholesterol. Your lipoproteins. Your small. So let's say Bill. Right, so Olivia, if you can help me pass a little more of those over some now.
Can you do something over there?
So obviously there's.
Keep going.
I'm just keep going. Let's put them all in there,
guys. Come on.
You were bragging.
Damn.
Well, now I'm spilling.
Oh my gosh!
You're in my intestines right now. So
no, we're actually in your heart, or your artery of your heart.
Oh,
okay.
Same thing.
What do we have here? If we total up all the cholesterol, just the cholesterol, it's 130. So it's lower than yours, your cholesterol. He doesn't have as much cholesterol, but how many more particles does he have to carry that cholesterol?
So much more.
Right.
So much.
So especially we found when we tested, Bill has these small, dense particles.
Easy.
And he eats a ton of vegetable oils because he listened to the American Heart Association. He replaced all his saturated fat with
soybean oil.
But soybean oil. And he's telling you, Olivia, we got to cook with that. We got to stop.
Me a soy boy?
Yeah. Yeah. In this case.
Bill's having
I can't lie. He sure is. But you can see the different, even though he has lower LDL cholesterol, he potentially has a higher risk of heart problems because each one of these little small, dense LDLs are more easily to be oxidized, going back into your arterial wall and forming these atheromas.
Okay.
So for the audio, for her, even though her number was
higher,
she had 4 large buoyant.
Yeah, and obviously it's more than 4, but we're just using it as a visual representation. So I'm going to separate into groups here Bill's small dense LDL, and then
you're just calling me retarded.
Yeah,
every time you say small and dense.
I don't know what to say, man.
Okay.
You said it, not me.
So technically I could be carrying more cholesterol,
yes,
but because of the fact that it's less, the kind that's
the carrier is different,
less likely to be oxidized
and less likely to get into the wall.
Yeah.
And, right, because it binds to the. So people are just listening to the audio. I have Olivia's 4 filled with cholesterol grouped together, and I have Bill's, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 small density LDLs. You're actually carrying more cholesterol. So if your doctor is just looking at your LDL cholesterol, that is not the whole story.
Yeah, it doesn't tell you a whole lot.
Right. But what's interesting, if we look back at the basic lipid profile, because what does it tell you? It tells you triglycerides, right? Yeah. It tells you HDL. It'll tell you LDL cholesterol, and it will tell you VLDL. Yeah. Right. So we talked about the 2 paths pretty much VLDL will take depending on how much triglycerides are in it. So if you got a ton of triglycerides in your VLDL because of your sugar, starchy diet that it has nowhere to go, it forms predominantly these small dense ones. Yeah. So without even doing the additional testing, there's a strong correlation between if, for instance, let's say your LDL is 150, but your triglycerides were low. Let's say that your triglycerides were 70 and your HDL was high. Okay. That is a very strong correlation with the large buoyant LDL. So you have low triglycerides, high HDL, almost always will correlate to more of this large buoyant type of LDL profile.
Okay.
So you can get something out of those lipid tests. You can infer from that without doing the further testing. You know, you could tell a lot about that.
Which is that test that you were just talking about.
Yeah. Without doing the particle size and particle number test. Because when you go ahead, like if I had that profile, your profile, and we went ahead and did the lipoprotein particle size and number, that association of high HDL and low triglycerides, regardless of what the cholesterol says, is almost always associated with a large buoyant type. Does that make sense so far? Whereas if you had cholesterol, or like Bill walks in here like, yeah, my LDL's 300. What's up? Not 300, 130. See, I got ahead of myself. My LDL's 130. I'm better than you.
Crappy impersonation of me.
That's right. But then I look at his triglycerides. I'm like, hey, Bill, what's up with this 300 triglycerides? And your HDL is 30, super low. So he would have high triglycerides, low HDL, which correlates very well to that VLDL stuck with a bunch of triglycerides, making a small, dense LDL particle.
Okay.
So those are the two patterns. So if you have high triglycerides, low HDL, no matter what your LDL cholesterol is, it's very highly correlated with a small, dense particle of LDL, which are the more problematic.
So so the ones that you really should be paying attention to isn't so much LDL.
Cholesterol, correct.
Or cholesterol. Well, because they have like the cholesterol and then they'll have like LDL.
I know.
Is it the same thing?
So total cholesterol includes
all of them?
All of it.
Okay.
Okay.
So, but basically the ones that really are the most important are your HDL and your triglycerides.
Yes.
Because your triglycerides are going to basically determine how much cholesterol you're ending up carrying in these VLDLs.
Yes, which is very low typically because you have to pack them full of triglycerides. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then
which is why you want a low number of triglycerides.
Yes. So if someone comes in, like read your actual numbers.
Chris, can you scoot over to your left a little bit?
Sorry, thanks.
Do you want like the total and then like all of them?
No, just read your LDL cholesterol, your triglycerides, and your HDL.
Okay. So LDL was 138. HDL was 68 and triglycerides was 52.
Right. So someone would say, oh, your LDL is borderline.
Yeah.
Like it's a little borderline high. And they'd be like, oh, we got to watch that.
Right.
Yeah. But your triglycerides are super low and your HDL is high. So regardless of what the LDL cholesterol says, you could have 130, right? But it's most likely carried by these large buoyant
And I just want to let people know that was when I was eating a ton of ground beef and cooking with ghee and animal fats. Thank you.
How dare you cook with saturated fats?
Yeah.
Well, you see the point because you can't really raise the cholesterol very much with diet. There are certain people with some genetic predispositions that we call them hyper responders, but it's a very small percentage.
What about eggs? I've been told my whole life that if I eat too many eggs, I am going to get heart disease and die of a heart attack.
But why?
Cholesterol.
From cholesterol.
Cholesterol.
Right. So we know that dietary cholesterol does very little to influence your blood levels of cholesterol because it's so regulated. Because if you take in more, the body's going to make less.
I have a question. So
real quick though.
Yes.
Eating saturated fat, people are like, because that is their big, so this is before I got to make this point. You remember last week we said the whole argument they have for saturated fat is it raises LDL cholesterol. That's the entire argument for not eating saturated fat.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, yes, saturated fat it can raise LDL cholesterol. But what we found is it also raises HDL cholesterol, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And the particles, when we look at them, it is more prone to the large buoyant type of LDL, the less problematic one. So that's why that leads us astray. That's why LDL cholesterol is such a poor predictor of heart attacks. Yeah. And that's why people that have normal cholesterol, like Bill, will say he had 130 or even lower, but he's full of these small, dense particles, right? So that's why the particle number matters, because it takes a lot more of these small, dense ones to carry the same amount of cholesterol that it takes for a large, buoyant type.
Okay.
Is that making sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. You had a question. I'm sorry.
Well, no, you're fine. I was thinking about how you're talking about diet and stuff like that. And I thought this was interesting. So, and this was probably from the 80s or 90s. My grandmother was told to do a low-fat diet.
Yep.
To lower her cholesterol, all this stuff, all her stuff. And my mom said her cholesterol shot through the roof when she started doing that. And I'm assuming it's because non-fat is replaced by sugars usually. And any of those products, non-fat, or low-fat, it's always sugars. And then
that's when you have a bunch of
triglycerides.
That's when you have a bunch of doctors that aren't even thinking about their basic science.
Yeah.
They forget all their biochemistry and they're going with some narrative that is just blatantly wrong. Again, you look at the whole good calories, bad calories thing by Gary Taubes. It shows you how that all kind of started. It's infuriating.
Well, the whole non-fat. I mean, growing up, we only had skim milk or non-fat milk.
Right.
We didn't have like whole milk with the full fat because there was such that movement in the early 90s.
And you look at people's health. Look at people's health.
Terrible.
Yeah, it's really gone downhill. So that's why I wanted to talk last week about the whole saturated fat thing before we did this one.
That makes sense.
Okay. So that whole dietary, whether it's red meat, whether it's eggs, dietary cholesterol has very little effect on actual body cholesterol because of how tightly cholesterol is regulated, if that makes sense. What dietary, like you said, what dietary factors do make a big difference is when you eat lots and lots of sugar and starch, which is basically sugar bound, glucose bound up, when you don't have anywhere for it to go. That's a real problem. So those are those scenarios. But before we get into it further, let's talk about HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, which is not cholesterol. Again, it's another carrier. It's a lipoprotein. HDL means high density lipoprotein. And so I'm going to move back over here. So I've used these little guys, and you can see they don't have the red striped tape around them. And I'll tell you why that's important in a minute. High density lipoprotein are cholesterol scavengers. One of the things it does is it takes, cholesterol from the periphery of the body, excess, scavenges it and brings it back to the liver. Because one of the other things that I didn't mention what cholesterol is used for is formation of bile salts. And those are very, very important to emulsify fats that we eat so we can digest fats. So the gallbladder secretes those things. And you can look at the proximity of the gallbladder and the liver. So the liver makes these bile salts. They're transported and stored in the gallbladder. And then there's a sensor for fat. Once fat's detected in the belly, the gallbladder squeezes and drops in bile salts to help emulsify and digest, absorb the fat. Cholesterol is a precursor to making those things. So this recycled cholesterol comes back. It has a ton of uses. It has a ton of uses in the body. So
bile salts are created by cholesterol?
Cholesterol. Yep. Cholesterol is the precursor for making bile salts. So
can you no longer make bile salts if you don't have a gallbladder?
No, you can't. So you make it in the liver. It's just stored in the gallbladder, and you have a harder time it's digesting fats.
Okay.
That's a whole thing. It's a rant about people getting their gallbladder removed that drives me insane.
And they're not told to. Well, I've heard. Yes.
Yeah, we'll talk. That's a whole nother rant. We'll talk about that later. So anyway, the HDL, it does other things too, and I don't want to get into it, but it's actually it's a reservoir for transferring these other types of structural proteins to the other lipoproteins. It's just going to confuse people. Really pay attention. The fact is, it's a scavenger. So high HDL has been associated with a lower risk of heart disease.
Okay.
Whether it's causative or whether it's just something we see as a trend, we're not really sure. But we do know it's involved in what's called reverse cholesterol transport. In other words, transporting excess cholesterol back to the liver for recycling. Okay, so you could think, okay, well that makes sense. Higher HDL particles, it makes sense that it would lower your risk of these things sticking around in the, excess cholesterol laying around. Now,
does it scavenge these ones?
It will scavenge excess cholesterol.
The small LDL?
Just the cholesterol itself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. These remnants are also then pulled back in to the liver, especially as well for recycling. Okay. So I just wanted to talk about that quickly so you can kind of understand what's going on there. Now, if you notice, one of the since I did all my initial research, 7 years ago, and I wrote about all the small dense versus large buoyant, it's gotten more sophisticated since then.
Oh, okay.
It's actually very interesting. What they found is, regardless of particle size, the overall particle number is more predictive of heart attack.
Oh, okay.
Okay. What that means is, but typically people don't have a high number if they have large buoyant LDLs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because they're able to carry their cholesterol as needed. It's not unheard of. There's some familial disorders where the LDL receptor isn't working right, and you do get a lot of these. Doesn't matter what type of particle, whether it's large buoyant or small dense, you can get a lot staying in circulation too long.
Okay.
But typically, when the particle number is high, they are typically a lot more of the small dense ones. Not always, but typically. So it makes sense that the overall particle number driving heart disease, makes sense. You can get your total LDL particle number, because when you do those NMR tests, you get particle size and number. So that's important. But another test has come out that makes it even easier. So if you notice on the VLDL, so people that aren't watching, I have the big VLDL cup. It has a red line around it. The large buoyant LDL, the larger low-density lipoprotein, has a red band around it. The small dense LDL has a red band around it too. You notice the HDL does not.
Yeah.
So that little red band around it represents a structural protein. It's called ApoB, apolipoprotein B. That's just what it's called. Okay, there's various flavors of that with different numbers. But the bottom line is we have a test now that tests for the presence of ApoB. There's one ApoB structural protein per particle, no matter what flavor of LDL, whether it's VLDL, buoyant LDL, or this one, or the small dense one. So if you measure your ApoB, there's one ApoB protein per particle, you get a pretty good idea of your particle number. And that has been very predictive of future heart disease.
Okay.
Which makes sense because it is a very good surrogate for the total amount of potential LDL particles. Yeah. So that is kind of a thing. So if I mean, you can do the particle count and size. It's kind of cool academically. But if you do a lipid panel and you see low triglycerides, high HDL, and your ApoB is normal, in other words, you don't have a whole bunch of particles, you're doing pretty darn well as far as the lipoprotein contribution to heart disease.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas, let's say you have and it doesn't matter what your cholesterol is to an extent. Let's say you have your LDL cholesterol is 170 and your doctor says, oh, that's high. But you have low triglycerides, okay, and high HDL, and your ApoB is normal. So that is a pattern where that doesn't promote much heart risk because, yes, you have a lot more cholesterol associated with the LDL, but it's more large buoyant and the total number of particles is low. Okay, does that make sense so far? Conversely, if you have, because remember, 50% of people with heart attacks have normal cholesterol.
Okay.
So let's say we have someone with normal cholesterol. Let's say their LDL is 110.
Okay.
Okay. And their triglycerides are 250 and their HDL is 40. So we have that pattern that suggests already they're small dense. And when we do their ApoB, which just measures total particle number, it's high. That person, even though they have normal, so-called quote unquote, normal cholesterol, has a lot more carriers that are potentially going to cause problems. Issues, And so that's why it's so important. And that's what infuriates me when I have someone come in for, talk to me, hey, my doctor told me I need to be on a statin, and because my LDL cholesterol is 160. Mm-hmm. And my next question is, what are your triglycerides? Oh, they're, 70. What's your HDL? Oh, 60. Okay. What's your ApoB? What's that? My doctor didn't run it. You see where I'm talking about? So we need to go a step further. There needs to be more education with primary care doctors to really risk stratify someone, because this isn't the only thing that causes heart disease, of course, but it's a component we can nail down fairly well. So those next steps need to happen if we're going to really give someone a better risk. It's like, hey, well, what is my risk of this? And do I need to be on a statin? Right. Speaking of which.
Well, before you go, I have a question.
Yeah. So remind me about statins.
Statins.
Okay.
Staten Island girl.
All right.
What? I don't know. If from a physician standpoint.
Yep.
Is it offensive if you're at 170, your cholesterol's high, and someone happened to listen to this podcast, they know a couple key terms, and they were to say, well, my triglycerides look good, my LDL looks good, right?
No, your triglycerides. Yep, HDL.
Okay. Can we go a little further and look at was it HBO? HPO? What was it?
ApoB.
Yeah, ApoB.
HBO.
You almost got it.
You nailed it. Can we, from a physician standpoint, if I was to ask about that, now maybe not you, but people would they be offended and be like, you don't know anything, stop YouTubing stuff?
So unfortunately, I think there's a much higher percentage of the latter, where you have basically, first of all, when a good doctor, like I get asked by my patients all the time stuff, I'm like, I don't know. That's a good question. And I'll actually go look it up. This is a lifelong learning process, being a physician. The ones that are very dogmatic and are stuck on something and they don't know, the worst part kind of doctor is one where they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
Right? They think they got it all down and this is the way, and you're asking, oh yeah, you need to stay off of Google, right? It's like, no, it's a very good question. And if you have a doctor like that, go find another doctor. Honestly. Because you could, a way to say, hey, I've seen, the triglyceride HDL ratio is seen as a much better predictor of future heart attack risk because of its correlation with particle size. And then with an ApoB, we can really get a good surrogate for my particle number, which is much more associated with the risk of cardiac disease before we talk about put me on a statin. But I mean, that's just someone not keeping up with the literature. And unfortunately, there's so much of a pharmaceutical influence in medical education. It is just absolutely absurd. I went through it.
Yeah.
So does that mean that statins are not good for some people? No, there is proven benefit of statins, especially with males who have had a heart attack already, because statins don't work just by lowering cholesterol. They have what's called pleiotropic effects. They are also an anti-inflammatory thing. Now, do I think you should just keep lowering cholesterol to very, very low levels? I mean, I've heard people say, you should lower it to 70. I mean, you're going to run into problems that, people start developing, muscle damage. And that's actually from depletion of CoQ10. That's a whole nother thing. But with older people, they start having memory deficits. Remember I told you that higher cholesterol is associated with health and survivability in older people? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's really important as we age to maintain those the integrity of our cell membranes, our nerve cell sheaths, myelin for cognition, because people one of the side effects of statins is they start talking about memory loss and cognitive problems. Yeah. Probably heard that too. So it's not like anti-statin or completely pro-statin. We need to have a more nuanced approach to this. So does someone, with this profile of, normal particle number from ApoB and more of a large buoyant type, even if their LDL cholesterol is a little elevated, I would argue that person doesn't need to be on statins. Now, this is really important. One of the mechanisms for statins, it lowers cholesterol production, which in turn upregulates the receptors. Because your body's like, oh, you're lowering my cholesterol production. Gosh, I need more receptors on the cells to pull more in because it's an essential nutrient. Mm-hmm. Okay, does that make sense? That's one of the reasons why it works. It upregulates that receptor. Well, we know that small, dense LDL don't bind well with the receptor. So what ends up happening is with statins is you end up preferentially taking the large buoyant ones out of circulation because they bind well with those increased number of receptors. And even though your cholesterol is lower, the particles you have lying around more often are then you're left with more of your small, dense ones. Does that make sense? Because you're now pulling the large buoyant ones out of circulation.
Is that also why some people because you were saying some people genetically, their receptors are not as receptive to that?
It's called familial hypercholesterolemia.
Is that why sometimes statins don't work on those people? Because even though they're producing more receptors, they're producing defective receptors?
Well, defective, And so, those people that are having a ton of it still will work. If you have familial hypercholesterolemia, those people absolutely do, statins can save them.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. It's not I'm not like completely anti-statin. I just think they're way overused because we don't do enough detective work, and we do this kind of knee-jerk reaction to LDL cholesterol.
Based on one. Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. Another very important point, since we're talking about that receptor, is that if you have low thyroid, okay, this is really important. So my wife does primary care, and she's had several patients come in and their doctor's trying to put them on statins and their thyroid's low, and she corrects their thyroid, and guess what? Everything else corrects itself. And the reason why that is on the gene for the LDL receptor. In other words, for an LDL receptor to be made, there needs to be a signal down to the gene to have it start production. Okay. It's called a promoter. Something binds to that part of the gene to make that LDL receptor. It promotes it. It makes an mRNA, which is a template for making the protein. Okay. And it makes the LDL receptor, then comes out to the cell surface. On that promoter of that LDL receptor gene is what's called a thyroid response element. In other words, thyroid hormone acts as a promoter for the LDL receptor. So if your thyroid is high, okay, we're going to make more LDL receptors because it's tied to metabolism too. It's like, okay, if my metabolism is upregulated, I'm going to be burning through. I need more cholesterol.
Yeah.
So it's going to upregulate the receptors, which then will pull in those LDL particles from the bloodstream. Makes sense. If thyroid hormone is low, you have a thyroid problem, you're not getting the signal to the LDL receptor to be made. You have less LDL receptors. Thus, you have more of these lipoproteins left in circulation, and your levels are going to be high on blood tests. So if you treat the thyroid, you normalize the LDL receptor expression, pulling the LDL particles out, and you can normalize it without doing a thing to the so-called cholesterol problem. So I'm saying all this because it's a lot more complex than just looking at this myopic view of your LDL cholesterol is high.
Yeah.
And they're just not staying up to date with, the evidence. Another thing that makes it even more complex is LDL itself as a particle is part of the immune system, part of the innate immune response.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so you can have, matter of fact, they think that familial hypercholesterolemia may be an evolutionary adaptive thing to help with pathogen defense, where the LDL particle actually will bind things called lipopolysaccharide, which is part of a gram-negative bacteria. It's involved with a bunch of different things, what we call an acute phase response to injury, all kinds of things. So if you had a recent injury or you have an infection and you go get your blood work done, your LDL is going to be elevated, even though it may not be what you normally run around with.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more to it than that, than just these simple things here, that we've oversimplified this, and we're going for the wrong target. So, back to the American Heart Association recommendations, you can see why it makes me have an aneurysm when they're like, you need to avoid cholesterol and saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated vegetable oils.
Yeah.
I'm not done ranting yet. So back to that last week's podcast, we talked about when you eat a lot of those polyunsaturated omega-6s, it throws off your balance. You have a higher omega-6 to 3 ratio, which promotes an inflammatory reaction. The more inflammation is present, the more oxidative stress we have, the more these small, dense LDLs are more prone to be oxidized. So that's why when you have a diabetic who, by the way, is insulin resistant, has high triglycerides, right? Has low level of inflammation constantly. They're producing a bunch of these small, dense particles. It's no wonder why they have such a high risk of heart disease.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's all these factors play into it. Smoking, that's why it causes heart disease. It creates a huge amount of inflammation, oxidative stress. Right? If you put your mouth on a muffler of the combustion byproducts, you're going to have oxidative stress. The same thing, you're basically pulling in burnt tobacco and combustion products, right? So you're pulling in a bunch of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, all kinds of stuff like that are basically creating all these free radicals your body has to deal with. And the more oxidative stress, the more prone those things are to oxidation. You see this vicious cycle that happens. So if you can get a diabetic for let's get their blood sugar under control. Let's have them stop making so much triglycerides in the liver.
Yeah.
Have them start exercising so that sugar has somewhere to go.
Yeah.
You can see how that all will start to, not only will it affect their, it doesn't matter whether or not they stop eating meat or any other dietary cholesterol at all. If they change their profile to then they start having more large buoyant type, right? They have decreased inflammation. We're not having as much of this small dense being made. I mean, that is the way we kind of start reversing that stuff. So what's interesting is there was an article kind of hammers this home. So this was a review article. It's from several years ago, from 2018. The title of it is "Inflammation, Not Cholesterol, is a Cause of Chronic Disease." And they basically go through this whole thing, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about here already, why just focus on cholesterol is kind of absurd, because when you look at traditional diets, like a true Mediterranean diet, where they eat large amounts of fats, has shown to actually reduce the amount of heart disease. So because they have lower levels of inflammation in general.
Yeah.
We have gotten so focused on this cholesterol issue. From a first principles perspective, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But as I've kind of outlined here, and how the biggest factors of diet that influence this are the amount of refined carbohydrate, sugar, right? The polyunsaturated omega-6 fats found in oils. All these things, are the opposite way we want to go, yet that dietary guidelines is telling you to do just that. Eat more grains and, things where we'll have a whole thing on grains that are just basically a bunch of starch,
Like it's heart healthy.
I know. So I wanted to finish a rant there and really kind of, because I'm sure you have some questions.
Maybe.
Or, but I mean, is there a part of that, especially those of you listening on audio, the visuals will really, really help. But is there anything on that whole, does that make sense, that process of why we can't just look at LDL associated 100%. Cholesterol and why there's no such thing as good cholesterol and bad cholesterol? It's really the carriers.
Yes.
And the type of carriers is important, and the number of carriers is important.
Yes, definitely. Makes a lot of sense.
So that red meat, the cholesterol you're eating and the eggs, Bill, that's not what's going to get you. Is that
outrageous?
That nut
They were flashing.
That's not what that lunch lady said in 6th grade. She said those scrambled eggs, you got too much. You got to eat egg whites only.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I know. And, and by the way, that's kind of funny to hear that. But, with kids, especially, cholesterol is really important for the developing brain because of how important it is for the neurons, especially. So putting a kid on a low fat, trying to eliminate, drive down their cholesterol is absolutely, it's just a horrible thing to do.
Yeah, that makes,
So, yes. What do you have?
Well, okay. So I did have a couple questions.
I figured.
Your book. Okay. Let's see. Oh, now I'm lost.
Here
Bill.
we go. Bail me out. Bail me out. I mean, I got a question from someone over here.
Yeah.
I got it.
She's got it.
Okay.
Nice.
So basically, what you're saying is diet is like that's where it all starts. Is where you need to change what you're putting in your mouth.
Correct.
So focus more on like your complex carbs, like your broccoli or vegetables. Stay away from refined carbs, like anything that's basically processed.
Yeah, of course.
As much as possible. Obviously, you can't completely eliminate those things, but
no, you can't.
Reduce.
Well, yeah, and for jiu-jitsu athletes or anybody that's really active, we talked about how refeeding carbohydrate is important because we have somewhere for it to go back into the muscle. Yeah, go ahead, continue.
Oh, yeah, and then I think that was, let's see my book. Oh, okay, so you said that cholesterol, for some people, it's genetic with the receptors. Is there any way that someone who, let's say, besides diet, I mean, obviously you'd want that, but is there any way to support those receptors to make them work better? Like if it is genetic?
It's a really good question. You want to stress the system as least possible. I mean, it's a genetic polymorphism with the LDL receptor. It doesn't work as well. So you have to have all those other things, like the amount of particles in your system. You need to have that dialed in really, really well. And that's where statins can actually help with that. Matter of fact, they're it's a pretty rare, it's fairly rare. It's not like a common thing. No, it's not a common thing. But those people do die very early from heart disease.
Is that a particular region or group of people that normally
You know
have
what?
that?
I haven't looked at the data to give you an educated answer on that. To look at if they're an ethnic group or an ancestral area where that comes from. I'd have to look into that more. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sure someone listening may know, but I'll actually do some research on that. That's a good question.
Okay. I think that's it.
What do you have, Bill?
I got me a couple questions.
All right.
First, it's actually about cholesterol.
Cool.
Why or how can two people with high cholesterol, let's say 320, pretty high.
Yep.
Good number. That gets you into the Hall of Fame in baseball, just so you know. So how can two people with high cholesterol both have bad diets end up with different outcomes? One has a heart attack at 49, let's say. The other, no issues till their 90s.
Yeah. So again,
really high cholesterol.
I would need to know more about both people and their lifestyle first. Exercise level, we need to know about smoking habit, right? Yeah. Any other kind of lifestyle factors because it is multifactorial, high blood pressure, things like that. But total cholesterol of 320 is a red flag to me, because I would be very concerned that there, regardless of what type of particle, small or large, there's probably a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I would also probably guess that I would also want to look at that person that lived to 90 with no problems. I'd want to look at some other things. We'd want to look at their ApoB, actually see what their particle numbers look like. And I'd also want to look at their triglycerides, and because I would probably surmise that the person that had a heart attack, all things else being equal, let's just assume they had the same other lifestyle factors, that they likely had a bunch of more particles and probably more small dense ones, because you can have equal amount of because remember, LDL cholesterol is just cholesterol associated with the LDL particle. And you could have thousands of small dense ones, or, hundreds of large buoyant ones, and they would carry a different risk, even though the total cholesterol is the same. But with a total of that high, I typically would want to do a strong workup on both those people, including maybe coronary calcium scoring and things like that, to better risk stratify them. Because that's, again, when it's that high, I at least want to look into something.
Let's say they both had the exact same diet.
Mm-hmm.
So then would that be a genetic component?
There could be.
Okay.
And it could be different for both of them. There's other factors involved. Again, just looking at the LDL cholesterol doesn't tell us the whole story, but at least for both of them, I'd want to do a lot further digging into it, and really try to risk stratify them both early, and catch that early, because looking at what their particles look like, and again, looking at coronary calcium scoring too, and to see, are there a lot of plaques in there already? Yeah, that's
But I guess, you're saying like lifestyle factors. So like if somebody out of the two, let's say one lived a more stressful lifestyle, or they had trauma as a child or something.
Totally.
So they're, and then the other one's more happy-go-lucky, like, calm and collected, then that could be a
huge factor. Yep. Type A personalities don't live as long.
Oh.
Uh-oh.
What are
in
we?
general? In general.
What's a type A personality?
This stresses every little thing. Everything's got to be exactly perfect. Everything is a issue. Every, mountains out of molehills. Yep.
Oh.
Yep. No, as a personality type. I mean, we all live through stress, and we all can't, we have situational stress, but how you deal with it, whether basically the type A, person's basically they have a high flight or fight the whole time. And the sympathetic nervous system, as we talked about before, remember in the stress lecture, that's pro-inflammatory in general.
Yeah.
So, they probably have a lot more underlying low-level inflammation and oxidative stress too. Yeah. Which drastically affects your heart disease risk. Yep. Yeah. Sure does. That's okay. Yeah, good one.
Okay. Well, I got a quick one as well.
Wait, this is your question?
No, this is someone else, Chris.
Okay. I just want to.
Okay. So, they said, I've read castor oil is good for the liver. Is this true?
I have no idea.
Not castrol.
I know castor.
Did you say casserole?
I said castrol.
I haven't looked at any research on castor oil. I honestly haven't. That would be, we'll have to table that one, because I don't want to just speculate something. I want to actually look into it.
What about, there was another oil. Was it palm oil? Was that another one?
Oh, yeah, palm oil.
So, Bill, I want you to do me a favor. We're going to use this as a Socratic method here.
Socratic.
Go on Google and look up fat composition of palm oil.
I know there's issues when it comes to, farming it, because I think it comes out of like the jungles or something.
Yeah, right? I mean, there could be all kinds of issues involved with the procurement and
so
for sure.
Okay.
What you got?
Palm oil contains approximately 50% saturated fatty acids with 44% palmitic acid.
Yeah.
C16, 5% stearic.
Okay. Which is 18 carbon.
Yep, carbon 18. And trace amounts of myristic.
Yeah.
14,
yeah, if that's the
14.
saturated fat component, what's the other components to it?
The unsaturated fatty acids are approximately 40% oleic.
Oleic. Yeah, so which is like olive oil.
And 10% polyunsaturated linoleic.
Yep. So that's an interesting composition for an oil. So palmitic acid, it's very interesting. Most of the studies on animal models of saturated fat have used palmitic acid. Palmitic acid is also the one that is produced by the body into a triglyceride and stored, and at high levels can become inflammatory. So I'd have to look at trials with palmitic acid, but of the saturated fats, and of course, this is reductionist, so let's be clear on this. All these things work together, but palmitic acid, of all the saturated fats, is the one has been associated with more of an inflammatory response. That's why I said it makes like where stearic acid, which is 2 carbons greater at 18, is completely different. It has anti-inflammatory properties to it. So, but all the things that have shown that when they study saturated fat, and they've done that for years in animal models, they just use straight palmitic acid, and they have all these inflammatory things. And plus, we're not mice, humans aren't. But it also has a high amount of monounsaturated oleic acid in it. So, these things work together. So in what we call a food matrix. So straight palmitic acid, probably not, I would suspect could be problematic, but mixed with, monounsaturated, and it has a relatively low amount of poly. So, that's probably not as problematic from an oxidative perspective. But I'd have to do a little more research to see if they've actually done that as palm oil.
And what the process is.
And how it's processed and that whole 9 yards. That's interesting. That's another one that I'm going to write down.
We started seeing it more, I think, more recently when we've been just looking more at the back of our food.
I've seen it.
We've been seeing it more on health, quote unquote, healthy options.
Yeah, it always makes me suspect.
Yeah.
Right? When you start seeing it in things that are packaged.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Especially the supposed healthy options.
Yeah. Well, of course. Exactly. Yeah. I will look into see if there's anything in the research specifically looking at it. But, like I said, just isolated palmitic acid doesn't seem to be the most favorable of the saturated fats. And that's a very interesting composition, because most things with saturated fat have a much more variety. The fact that it has that much of palmitic acid is very interesting. And I could be wrong about, that studied in humans. I'm just going from a first principles perspective of, we do know that overloaded fat cells with palmitic acid especially activate a macrophage inside the fat cell, which turns it pro-inflammatory. So, which we'll do a podcast in the future about fat, as far as body fat. And
we should get Andrew on for that one.
Of why that is part of the, it would probably be a podcast on inflammation in general.
Oh, Josh too. Yeah.
Which, so you named 2 people that are going to whip up on you. That's awesome. I like how you troll.
I can't roll.
What do you
What?
I said I'm injured. I can't roll.
Oh, okay. He's playing possum.
I do want to say last week Bill had brought up McDonald's, and I looked it up, and apparently McDonald's did use beef tallow on their fries until 1990, and then they switched to vegetable oil
because it's so much cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and beef tallow and that a lot less oxidizable, right? Yeah, that's unfortunate. You've seen that more and more. And, it's interesting that these guidelines are aligning with a lot of things we're seeing in the food industry. Bill is wearing, where's your hat, Bill?
Oh, sorry.
You show everyone he has a hat that says tin foil on it. So you know, just in case we ever get into that conspiracy theory territory. Very nice. So was that useful for you both?
Yeah.
It's very good. I can now explain it to my mom because
you learned me something.
She doesn't understand, like, I think a lot of this, like most people, you know, don't.
Well, when most of the doctors are
they don't
still
explain it, yeah.
well, and I quite frankly, I can tell you after with conversations with some of my colleagues, they don't know it. And it's not excusable because they're recommending treatments.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not
100%.
excusable not to know.
Yeah.
And to look into it. And again, I'm not anti-statin, but I think it's used way too much. And I think there's an opportunity for people to really change a lot of their metabolic health, including their lipoprotein profile with diet and exercise. Yeah. Excellent. Anything else? Are we going to wrap this one up?
I think I might do every podcast from over here because I don't know if you guys noticed, but the old guns are looking pretty good.
Oh my god!
Look at this lighting.
I thought it was because you were gonna say you can just hide in the corner and eat your candy.
I'm just saying. Yours are looking a little stringy over there, old man.
Don't make me take my shirt off.
Oh my goodness. My wife is in the room. Can you back off? That's it. No other questions.
No other questions. Bill's guns are amazing.
Thank you. Until next time.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have, I believe we have Carrie planned next, don't we?
And we're going to be talking about testicles and
stuff testicles make, like testosterone.
Yes. It'll be real good.
So I think it'll be a good one. Again, any questions, please submit them.
Yeah. Especially coming or going forward for estrogen, thyroid, testosterone. These are all things that Carrie's going to be.
Yeah, she's going to talk a lot about testosterone replacement too.
Yeah.
So that should be very interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm playing Olivia's song.
I do love it.
Awesome. Have a good one.
Guys down. See you guys later.